Hello, my friend, it's Gina, to continue sharing this story with you, an account that's based on a true story, one that, as of this recording, remains ongoing. Welcome back to Lost Sister, a Discarded Woman, Episode 4. Content warning: this and future episodes contain sensitive topics and may cause distress to some listeners. Hearing disturbing actions of oppression, manipulation, and abuse can bring up painful memories, personal struggles, and trauma for many. Narrators note, the names have been changed and places are purposefully arbitrary to protect the privacy of those involved. This podcast is our way of telling Catherine and Elizabeth's story so that others can be aware of potential future issues. The central figures in this story include Catherine, her sister Elizabeth, Elizabeth's husband Walter, and Walter's granddaughter Darcy. Let's do a quick catch-up. Elizabeth, a retired doctor with dementia, and her husband Walter were missing before Elizabeth's little sister Catherine found them months later. Walter's granddaughter Darcy had moved Elizabeth and Walter without a word to Elizabeth's family. By episode 3, we find that the bank, where Darcy holds an account as Elizabeth's guardian, has refused to give any information to Catherine, who is now the court-appointed guardian for her sister Elizabeth. Catherine also met with a Social Security Administration investigator, where she learned that not only did Darcy use Catherine's name as Darcy's own mother's name. Okay, to be fair, not completely. After all, there was a letter changed. But that the Social Security Administration is going to investigate Darcy. There is also now a complaint lodged against Darcy with the IRS due to so many irregularities coming to light. We also learned that Elizabeth had been on the emergency room on 3 separate occasions within just a few months. Each visit for a dislocated shoulder. Then, to top off the nightmare, Darcy has taken Elizabeth's family back to court in order to protest that the judge replaced Darcy with Catherine as Elizabeth's guardian. And lo and behold, through no fault of Catherine's, the judge did an about-face and allowed Darcy to once again become the guardian of Elizabeth. And so we press on. Utterly devastated, Elizabeth's family is in total disbelief. How the hell did this happen? Not only did they lose guardianship, but Darcy banned the family, all of them, from visiting Elizabeth. I bet the ink wasn't even dry on that guardianship paperwork. Once again, the family agree that they will continue to fight for Elizabeth's sake. There is a fear that Elizabeth could lose the progress she's been making over the last month. Or worse, she might slide back to a point of no return. With no visitors, no stimuli, no outings, nothing to look forward to. And, who knows, Elizabeth might be told that the family abandoned her again. It would certainly be feasible. Once again, a discarded woman. Now, you might be wondering, why is the family so hell-bent on rescuing Elizabeth? I mean, it's great, but they are spending an inordinate amount of time and money to help Elizabeth. So let's go back to some of Elizabeth's beginnings. She's the middle child of a large family. She was always the peacemaker. You know, they say middle children tend to be more agreeable and mild-mannered, since they must compromise throughout their life. A lot of the time, middle children end up deferring to the oldest wants and the youngest needs. Elizabeth was extremely intelligent, and she knew she wanted to be a doctor more than anything. Coming from a poor farming family, she didn't know if this could be possible, but still, she held on to that dream. Somehow, she would make it come true, and she did. She received scholarships, which would make college a reality. In the early 1970s, with Elizabeth fresh off the farm and heading off to college, she was a devoted student, a voracious reader, a hard-working country girl, a true innocent who had never dated, not one boyfriend, ever, no experience whatsoever with a boy other than family, but certainly not a man. So when a man almost 10 years older started showing her attention, she was at a loss. To say she was flattered is a complete understatement. Very much out of her depth, Elizabeth is immediately infatuated, charmed by his interest, along with the fact that he had been recently discharged from the military and now in college. They started spending time together, and even though Elizabeth is a full-time student, has a double major and working on campus, she finds the time because boyfriend, her first boyfriend, and he's an older man. Her life had certainly made a lot of changes since arriving at the university. And in case you haven't picked up on it by now, Elizabeth is one of the kindest, most genuine people you could ever meet. She had dreamed of being a doctor for so long, and not for the money. Oh no, not our Elizabeth. But because she honestly and truly wanted to help others. And because she was the kind, helpful, gracious young woman, she naively believed every single word that came out of Walter's mouth. Not surprisingly, she hid the fact from her family that she had a boyfriend. Especially when he talked her into practically moving in with him. But when her parents and little sister Catherine came for a surprise visit one weekend, it was no longer a secret. The encounter did not have a good ending. After all, she is 19, and as many parents of college kids learn, you can scoop them up, take them back to their dorm room, scold and threaten as much as you like about all the dangers of losing yourself in their very first youthful relationship and forgetting all about the education. But young people will do what they want in the long run. Elizabeth and Walter became inseparable, except when they were in class or Elizabeth went to work one of her jobs. Elizabeth graduated with a double major and accomplished all of that while working and dealing with a demanding boyfriend, but she did it in 3 years with honors. Walter also got his bachelor's degree and a master's, fulfilled the requiring interning, and found a job. Much to the exasperation of her parents, Elizabeth and Walter were married. And Elizabeth is ready for med school. Because of her medical school admission test scores, she'd received a lot of invitations from several top colleges around the country. She finally settled on a really good state school. Walter declared to Elizabeth's father that he, Walter, had no intention to pay for med school. If they wanted Elizabeth to go to med school, they would have to pay for everything, because he certainly wouldn't. This wasn't as simple as writing a check. There are still more siblings with college plans, too. Even though there are scholarships, it's still very difficult financially. But Elizabeth's dad would not let her down. She would go to med school. He would make it happen somehow. Helping Elizabeth to become a doctor was that important. Conflicts with the family was a normality when Elizabeth and Walter visited the farm. And even though everyone, especially little sister Catherine, desperately missed Elizabeth, they were thankful that the newlyweds didn't visit often, and when they did, their stays were short. Walter seemed to go out of his way to pick fights. He was argumentative. Everything became a debate, and he knew about everything, much more than anyone else. You know the type, right? His manners were atrocious. He seemed to delight in making people uncomfortable. Family, neighbors, even total strangers. Elizabeth spent the visits defending her husband and begging her family to just let it go. What her family didn't know was that Walter had pursued Elizabeth for the very fact that if she did become a doctor, she'd be able to support him handsomely. He groomed her, verbally and mentally abused her if she did not readily comply. It would be dangerous if she didn't. In the 1970s, abuse from a spouse just wasn't talked about. Elizabeth had no doubt that the response would have been, "Well, you made your bed, now you gotta lie in it." She had never experienced this kind of treatment from her own family, and probably wouldn't even have known at the time to consider it as abuse. As the years passed, Elizabeth finished med school, completed her internship, and the couple settled into a new life several states away from home. Once again, they very rarely came home, so the family could hope for an occasional phone call from Elizabeth, but that was it. And then when she did, she had to take great pains to be able to do even that. A little sidebar. By the mid-1970s, the number of women graduating from medical school had increased significantly, up to a whopping 16% of all med school graduates. Now, when Catherine finished her degree, she accepted a job that was close enough to Elizabeth that they could meet to go shopping, have a meal together, and just talk. These occasions were so special, and not as often as they would like, but it had to do. Catherine rarely visited Elizabeth and Walter at their house. You see, Catherine knew that challenging Walter's confrontations could turn dangerous for Elizabeth. Catherine talked with Elizabeth about leaving Walter many times, but Elizabeth just wouldn't. All Catherine could do is to be there for her sister whenever and however she could. Now, before you think, well, she should have just left him, or she should have just said, take a hike, which is a very human response in the 2020s. But in the 1970s, not so much. The social norm was for better or worse, especially where Elizabeth came from. Women just dealt with whatever the worse was to come. Also, a little reminder, the Violence Against Women Act wasn't even created and enacted until 1994. And even with that, at this time, it still needs reauthorization in 2027. Elizabeth had never experienced seeing a marriage like this. Her father never treated his wife like Walter treats Elizabeth. But after years of gaslighting, mental and physical and financial abuse, the embarrassment and shame is overwhelming. Regardless, if you have never dealt with it yourself, congratulations. No, seriously. You, my friend, are one of the lucky ones. However, odds are you know someone who is currently struggling with it right now. Or you know somebody who has been abused at least once in their life. What goes on behind closed doors would be staggering for many, because statistics show that in America, 1 in 5 women are abused. 1 in 5. And while we're at it, multiple studies show that it takes a woman 7 times on average to finally leave for good. In Elizabeth's case, we know she left at least on 3 separate occasions, including once where she left for over a year and filed for divorce. She had built a new life for herself, a happy and successful one too. She traveled, had friends, had visits from family, her mother and Catherine in particular. Her first real taste of freedom, until he found her. He shamed, threatened, and manipulated her until she finally gave in. So you see, the family had lost Elizabeth to her abusive and controlling husband before. This time, it's as if Walter's own hand is pulling Elizabeth away again. Only now, it's Walter's granddaughter continuing the control and abuse. And the family are determined to do whatever they can to help Elizabeth live a life as happy as possible for the rest of her days. And Catherine feels that the best way to do that is to regain guardianship. Since nothing has been simple since the ill-fated, unanswered phone call to Elizabeth, oh so long ago now, at least this time, Catherine had a decent place to start. The detective. Remember? The one who reached out to her just before that last hearing. And let me tell you, what Catherine heard was, it's what I should call the "ya can't make this shit up" chapter. The detective learned that probate had been filed the same day Walter died. No doubt, that isn't unheard of, I guess. But most people have other things on their mind while they're grieving the loss of a loved one, like contacting their family and friends and making funeral arrangements. Not only that, but in the probate filing, Darcy indicated that Walter's assets included an account with tens of thousands of dollars, which was curious because the detective also discovered in the hospital records a statement by Darcy that both Walter and Elizabeth needed to be placed in assisted living facilities because neither are capable to make decisions and would also need financial assistance because of their lack of funds. My personal WTF moment was hearing that Walter's will was changed 3 days after Elizabeth was admitted to the hospital. What was that? Did I hear you just say, hold on, Gina? Didn't we just learn that Darcy made a statement to the hospital when they had admitted Elizabeth that both Elizabeth and Walter were incapable of making decisions? Well, why, yes, you are correct. So how the hell was it possible for him to change his will 3 days later? And even more curious was that by some extraordinary happenstance, Darcy managed to drag herself out of Section 8 housing that she had accepted only a few months earlier. And then suddenly, she was able to purchase a house for herself. Okay, so you might want to sit down for this one, folks. The house she bought was well over $750,000, and it was paid for in cash, which coincidentally happened 2 days after she disclosed Elizabeth's whereabouts to Catherine. Uh-huh. Shall I repeat that? Of course. Darcy accepted Section 8 housing assistance and then bought a house a few months later for over $750,000 in cash. Now, in the area of the country this house is in, that's a huge ass property. Huge. Sure, it's not the only house like that in the area, but they're generally owned by doctors, owners of very successful companies, maybe a few attorneys. But we both know Darcy does not belong in that kind of club. To top all of that, the detective had also found that Darcy's divorce was finalized about a week before Walter's death, that she had formed an LLC 2 days before Walter's death, and that 2 days after his death, he was cremated. And, oh yeah, there was no funeral. Curiouser and curiouser. But hey, busy woman. I hear you. The timeline of all of this is bonkers, right? So just remember this. All of these occurrences that the detective gathered and shared with Catherine happened from the day Elizabeth was admitted to the hospital until the purchase of the house was just about 6 months. Now, after hearing all of this, Catherine and the family made the decision to go back to their attorney. And if the attorney was willing to take on the necessary steps to once again challenge Darcy for the guardianship, then so were they. The challenge would be based on the very valid reason that Walter left his estate to Darcy. And you may well ask, well, what's the problem with that? Well, somebody moved money. A lot of money. From what they can discern at this point is a very large sum was moved from an Elizabeth account to a Walter account the day after the last emergency room visit, while Elizabeth is still in the hospital. After the hospital was told that she had end-stage dementia. So, signing paperwork to move a large sum of money is okay? Oh boy. Well, let's dissect this a little. Number one, it is complicated. But most states give a surviving spouse what's called an elective share of the deceased spouse's estate, regardless if there's a will or not. One spouse cannot take all of the marital funds and give it to another entity that leaves the surviving spouse insolvent. But that's exactly what happened here. All of Elizabeth's assets were moved into an account in Walter's name while she was in the hospital for her shoulder surgery. Plus, quite obviously, Elizabeth is very much alive, damn it. Number two, both Elizabeth and Walter have been incapable of making decisions, any decisions, for a very long time, due to their health and mental awareness. Not only would it be apparent to anyone speaking with them for more than a passing hello, but remember, there's documentation that Darcy herself made in the statement that's included in the record at the hospital when Elizabeth was admitted, that both of them, Elizabeth and Walter, aren't capable of making decisions. Number three, the state that Darcy has moved Elizabeth and Walter to makes surviving spousal rights complicated, but regardless, their surviving spouse has the right to challenge the will. And because Elizabeth has a guardian, it's the guardian who's the only entity that can challenge the will. Why would somebody need to challenge a will? One very important reason. It's called testamentary capacity. Well, that's legalese for legal and mental capacity required by a person writing a will. Some people may lack testamentary capacity when their mental competence is compromised, like dementia or Alzheimer's disease, or any other incapacitating circumstances. So it boils down to this, my friend. The heir to an estate cannot also be the guardian. And because of her mental decline, the guardian that Elizabeth has is Darcy. The heir to Walter's estate is Darcy. It's called a conflict of interest, and it's the law. At the very minimum, Elizabeth deserves her share of the money she worked a lifetime to earn. Pretty straightforward if you ask me. Now, regardless of the past, Catherine and the family are determined to find out everything that they can to help regain the guardianship. Even though there were several hearings set over the next few months, initiated by the family, not much became of them. There was a new judge who wasn't familiar with the case, and some blockades by Darcy's ever-growing list of attorneys. They managed to kick the can down the road. Finally, the hearing they've been working towards is set. It's been almost 3 months since Darcy regained guardianship and had forbidden the family to visit Elizabeth. However, there always seems to be another however in this story. Nevertheless, however, now there's another rather unusual piece of information to digest. Catherine received a phone call a few days before the hearing date from, surprise, Darcy, to tell you that it was a virtual, fanciful, one-sided conversation that lasted over an hour is not hyperbolic whatsoever. It was well documented and witnessed by another source. At this point, it's not clear at all. Was Darcy also groomed? Or was she the groomer all along? Join us soon for episode 5, Lost Sister, a Discarded Woman, where we dive into the phone call and learn what happens at the all-important court hearing. Thank you. Abuse in all forms is an equal opportunity instrument of control, regardless of age, gender, IQ, education, or socioeconomic status. The terms elder abuse, elder neglect, and elder fraud are relatively new. In general, elder abuse is a term referring to any knowing, intentional, or neglectful act by a caregiver or any other person that causes harm or a serious risk of harm to a vulnerable person. Legislators in all 50 states have passed some form of elder abuse prevention laws. A good place to start for more information is the website justice.gov/elderjustice. And if you suspect elder abuse, there is help. The National Elder Fraud Hotline is 1-833-FRAUD-11. That's 833-372-8311. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is 1-800-799-SAFE. That's 800-799-7233. These links and phone numbers are also located on the Lost Sister webpage, lostsister.buzzsprout.com. Thank you for listening. I hope you continue following as Elizabeth's family struggle to help her in Lost Sister, a Discarded Woman. If you enjoyed this episode, please share with your family and friends. Our hope is to share Elizabeth and Catherine's story so that it might help others to avoid the same happening to them or someone they love. Thank you.